The untold story
It's
of
like a
Pet
soundtrack to a
Sounds,
movie that
how
hasn't been
Brian
made
Wilson changed music forever. Chapter 1: Redefining Pop Music. Once upon a time, on the sunlit shores of California, where surfboards danced across waves and radios hummed with joyful harmonies, there was a young man who quietly dreamed of something more. His name was Brian Wilson. To most of the world, Brian was the musical heart of the Beach Boys, a band that captured the spirit of youth, sunshine, and summer fun. Their songs were bright, their harmonies tight, and their image sparkled like the Pacific coastline. From Surfing USA to California Girls, the Beach Boys had become America's soundtrack to endless summer. They represented everything carefree about the 1960s: convertible cars, beach parties, and the innocent romance of teenage life. But Brian, he heard something else entirely. While his bandmates celebrated another hit climbing the charts, Brian would sit alone at his piano, pressing keys that spoke of deeper emotions. He would listen to the way light filtered through his Hawthorne home, translating those golden California afternoons into chord progressions that somehow felt both hopeful and melancholy. The same fingers that crafted fun, fun, fun yearned to express the complexity of growing up, the bittersweet nature of memory, and the profound loneliness that could exist even in a crowded room. He wanted to make music that could move your soul, not just your feet. Something tender, honest, vulnerable. Something that went beyond surf and sand, beyond the carefully constructed image of perpetual youth and endless summer. Brian envisioned music that could capture the full spectrum of human emotion: the doubt, the wonder, the quiet moments of introspection that happened when the party was over and you were left alone with your thoughts. So, in the quiet corners of his mind, between the demands of touring and recording, a new kind of album began to take shape. One that would someday be called Pet Sounds. It would be an album that dared to ask, what if pop music could be art? What if it could speak to the parts of ourselves we rarely shared with others? What if 3-minute songs could contain entire universes of feeling? An album that would forever change what pop music could be. Chapter 2: Origins of a Genius. Brian didn't have an easy start. As a child, an accident left him 98% deaf in his right ear, a cruel twist of fate for someone destined to hear music in ways others never could. The world from then on became strangely one-sided. Sounds arriving from unexpected angles, conversations becoming puzzles to solve. But his musical imagination, that remained limitless, perhaps even enhanced by this unique way of processing sound. Growing up in the Wilson household meant living with Murray Wilson, a failed songwriter who saw his sons as his second chance at musical success. Murray was demanding, often harsh, pushing his boys to practice and perform while nursing his own frustrated dreams. The family home was filled with tension, Murray's explosive temper alternating with moments of musical guidance that shaped Brian's understanding of harmony and melody. The Beach Boys were constantly touring, and with each performance, the pressure grew heavier on Brian's shoulders. He wasn't just the primary songwriter and producer, but also the musical visionary responsible for maintaining the band's success. Night after night, he would stand on stage, smiling and harmonizing, while inside, he felt increasingly disconnected from the joy their music was supposed to represent. The screaming crowds, the relentless travel, the pressure to constantly create new hits, it all began to feel like a beautiful prison. In 1964, on a flight high above the clouds, somewhere between Los Angeles and Houston, the stress finally overwhelmed him. The cabin pressure seemed to mirror the pressure in his head, and suddenly he found himself unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to maintain the facade any longer. He collapsed into tears and silence, his bandmates gathering around him with concern and confusion. That day, suspended between earth and sky, he made a decision that would change everything. He decided he couldn't do it anymore. He wouldn't tour with the band again. The announcement sent shockwaves through the Beach Boys organization. How could the group's musical leader abandon them on the road? But Brian was resolute. He needed to step back, to find himself again, to rediscover why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. But where one door closed, another quietly opened. Freed from the endless cycle of hotels and concert halls, Brian now had the time and the quiet to create, to listen, to dream. He could spend entire days at the piano, following melodic ideas wherever they led. He could experiment with sounds and arrangements without the pressure of having to perform them night after night. For the first time in years, music became a sanctuary again, rather than a burden.
Chapter 3. Inspiration Struck. In the stillness of his Beverly Hills home, surrounded by the trappings of success, but feeling somehow empty, Brian picked up Rubber Soul, the latest album from the Beatles. As he listened, something shifted deep in his consciousness. The opening chords of Drive My Car weren't just the beginning of another song. They were an invitation into a complete artistic world. This wasn't just a collection of songs thrown together to capitalize on hit singles. It was a journey, carefully crafted and sequenced, a complete artistic statement that took the listener from one emotional landscape to another. John Lennon and Paul McCartney weren't just writing pop songs, they were creating a unified emotional experience, and Brian felt a spark light deep inside him, igniting possibilities he had never considered. The revelation hit him like a wave crashing against the Malibu shore. Brian had been writing hits like Surfing USA, California Girls, and Help Me Rhonda, but they were individual expressions, separate entities that existed in isolation. What the Beatles had achieved was something far more ambitious. They had created a sonic novel where each track was a chapter contributing to a larger narrative arc. The album breathed as a single organism, each song drawing meaning from its placement within the whole. He began playing the album obsessively, studying not just the individual songs, but the spaces between them. The way one track's fade out created anticipation for the next track's opening. He noticed how the melancholy of Norwegian Wood gave deeper meaning to the optimism of The Word, how the introspection of In My Life was made more poignant by being surrounded by more playful tracks. Every decision, tempo, key, lyrical theme, instrumental arrangement served the album's greater emotional purpose. He began to see albums differently. What if instead of just collecting the band's latest hits and filling out the space with filler tracks, an album could be like a novel? What if each song was a chapter in a larger story, contributing to an overarching theme or emotional arc? The idea consumed him,
keeping him awake at night as he played different song sequences in his head, imagining how one emotion could flow into the next. He started sketching out emotional maps on piano manuscript paper, not musical notes, but feeling progressions. He would write words like yearning and hope and melancholy, then draw arrows between them, creating flowcharts of human experience. He began to understand that an album could take listeners on a psychological journey, guiding them through the complex terrain of growing up, falling in love, facing disappointment, and finding meaning in uncertainty. The concept became an obsession that colored everything he experienced. Walking along the beach, he would imagine how the sound of waves might translate into a song that captured the internal nature of longing. Sitting in traffic on the freeway, he heard rhythms that could express the mechanical alienation of modern life. Even mundane moments, waiting in line at the grocery store, watching television, having dinner with his wife, became opportunities to collect emotional fragments that might eventually crystallize into music. Around the same time, Brian began to experiment, first with marijuana, then with LSD, hoping to unlock the hidden corners of his mind. This wasn't casual drug use or party behavior. For Brian, these substances were tools of exploration, ways to access parts of his consciousness that remained closed during ordinary states of awareness. Under their influence, he could hear colors, see sounds, and feel the interconnectedness of all things. Music became a living entity, breathing and pulsing with its own life force. The psychedelic experiences revealed layers of reality that his sober mind couldn't perceive. He would sit at his piano for hours, feeling the vibrations of each note, not just in his ears, but throughout his entire body. Chords became three-dimensional structures that he could walk through and explore from different angles. Melodies took on personalities, becoming characters in an ongoing drama that unfolded across the keyboard. During one particularly profound LSD experience, Brian felt as though he could communicate directly with the music itself. He understood that every song that had ever been written was somehow connected, part of a vast musical ecosystem where influences and inspirations flowed like underground rivers. He saw his own music as part of this larger tapestry, and he realized that his responsibility as an artist was not just to entertain, but to contribute something meaningful to this eternal conversation between human souls. It wasn't just about getting high. For Brian, it was about seeing things differently, feeling more deeply. The drugs stripped away the conventional boundaries of thought, allowing him to consider musical combinations that would never have occurred to him his sober mind. He called it a spiritual awakening, and from that awakening came a bold idea that would reshape his entire approach to making music. What if an album could feel like a single unified emotion? What if it could speak your heart back to you, reflecting your deepest feelings in ways that individual songs never could? What if the spaces between songs were as important as the songs themselves, creating a continuous emotional experience that ebbed and flowed like the ocean waves he had grown up beside? The vision became more clear during a particularly vivid session where Brian experienced what he later described as a direct transmission from some divine creative source. He saw an album that would function like a music therapy session, taking listeners through the full spectrum of human vulnerability, from the excitement of new love to the pain of self-doubt, from the joy of connection to the ache of loneliness. It would be honest in ways that pop music had never been honest, exploring the gray areas of emotion that most songs avoided in favor of simple, marketable feelings. The vision was becoming clearer, an album that would be a complete artistic statement, every element carefully chosen and placed to serve the larger emotional journey. It would be pop music, but pop music elevated to the level of high art. It would be accessible enough for teenagers to hum along, but sophisticated enough to reward careful listening by adults who had experienced the complications of real life. Most importantly, it would be true, not just musically, but emotionally and spiritually true to the experience of being human in all its beautiful, terrible complexity.
Chapter 4: The Birth of Pet Sounds. While the rest of the Beach Boys embarked on their tour of Japan, maintaining the band's international presence and fulfilling contractual obligations, Brian stayed behind in California. He had work to do, the most important work of his career. He needed a collaborator, someone who could help him translate the swirling emotions in his head into words that others could understand and connect with. The decision to remain behind wasn't easy. The tour was important. It was the Beach Boys' first international venture, a chance to expand their audience and prove that American surf music could succeed on a global stage. Brian's absence would be noticed and questioned. Band members, management, and record executives all pressured him to join the tour, arguing that his presence was essential for the band's live performances and international reputation. But Brian knew that this moment was crucial. The vision for what would become Pet Sounds was still fragile, like a dream that might disappear if he didn't capture it immediately. He could feel the music demanding to be born, and he understood intuitively that if he didn't act on this inspiration now, it might never return with the same intensity. The creative fire that had been lit by Rubber Soul was burning at its brightest, and he couldn't risk letting it dim by focusing on the routine demands of touring. He found that collaborator in Tony Asher, a thoughtful young lyricist who worked in advertising by day but dreamed of writing songs that mattered. Tony was different from the typical Tin Panny Alley songwriters. He was introspective, articulate, and unafraid to explore the more vulnerable aspects of human experience. When Brian explained his vision for an album about growing up, about the complexity of relationships, about the uncertainty that comes with leaving childhood behind, Tony understood immediately. The connection between Brian and Tony was instantaneous and profound. Where other lyricists had tried to match Brian's melodies with clever wordplay or commercial hooks, Tony understood that what Brian needed was emotional authenticity. He could sense the deeper currents of feeling that flowed beneath Brian's musical ideas, and he had the literary skill to translate those feelings into lyrics that were both personal and universal. Tony brought his own perspective to the collaboration, the viewpoint of someone who was also struggling with questions of identity and purpose in the rapidly changing landscape of the 1960s. He was part of a generation that was questioning traditional values, exploring new ways of thinking about love and relationships, and grappling with the gap between public expectations and private realities. His advertising background had taught him how to communicate complex ideas simply and memorably. But his artistic sensibilities yearned for work that went beyond selling products to selling truths. They began meeting daily at Brian's piano, a ritual that became sacred to both men. Brian would play chord progressions that seemed to contain entire emotional worlds, and Tony would listen, letting the music suggest lyrics and themes. Together, they began to turn Brian's feelings into words: melancholy, hope, insecurity, and longing. These weren't the simple emotions of traditional pop songs, but the complex, contradictory feelings that define real human experience. The creative process was unlike anything either man had experienced before. Brian would arrive at the piano with fragments, a chord progression, a melodic phrase, sometimes just a feeling that he couldn't yet articulate. He would play these musical sketches repeatedly, allowing them to evolve and develop while Tony listened and absorbed the emotional content. Tony would then begin suggesting words and phrases, not trying to impose meaning on the music, but allowing the lyrics to emerge organically from the musical DNA that Brian had created. Often they would spend entire sessions working on just a few lines of lyrics, searching for words that captured not just the surface meaning of the song, but its deeper emotional resonance. Brian didn't want hit singles in the traditional sense. He wanted meaning. He wanted songs that would matter to people, not because they were catchy, but because they were true. Each song on Pet Sounds would be a window into the soul, exploring different aspects of the same fundamental human experience, from innocence to confusion, from love to loneliness, from hope to resignation. It would be a world inside a record. This approach was revolutionary for its time. The music industry in 1965 was still largely focused on creating individual hits that could be promoted on radio and sold as singles. Albums were often afterthoughts, collections of songs that included one or two potential hits, padded with filler material. The idea that an album could be a unified artistic statement, with each song contributing to a larger theme, was virtually unheard of in popular music. But Brian and Tony were operating from a different set of values. They were more interested in creating something that would endure than something that would immediately top the charts. They wanted to make music that would grow more meaningful with repeated listening, that would reveal new layers of depth as listeners matured and experienced their own versions of the emotions the album explored. The songs began to emerge. Wouldn't It Be Nice explored the yearning of young love constrained by social expectations. You Still Believe in Me was a tender acknowledgement of love despite personal flaws. It was Brian's way of expressing gratitude for acceptance while also confessing his own sense of unworthiness. The song captured the paradox of being loved despite one's imperfections, the simultaneous relief and guilt that comes with receiving forgiveness. That's Not Me tackled questions of authenticity and self-discovery that were particularly relevant to young people in the rapidly changing landscape of the 1960s. It was about the courage required to reject false versions of oneself in favor of more honest, if more vulnerable, self-expression. And so the album began to take form, not as a collection of tracks, but as a gentle arc of emotion. A concept album, though they didn't use that term yet. One of the very first of its kind. It would establish a template for how popular music could be organized around themes and emotional journeys, rather than just commercial potential. The creative partnership between Brian and Tony became a model for how popular music could be elevated through thoughtful collaboration. They were creating something that neither could have achieved alone. Brian provided the musical sophistication and emotional depth, while Tony contributed the literary skills and psychological insight necessary to translate feelings into words. Together, they were writing the handbook for how pop music could address adult themes while remaining accessible and beautiful.
Chapter 5: Studio as an Instrument. Brian turned to the studio not as a place to simply record songs that had already been written and arranged, but as an instrument in itself, a place where magic could happen, where the impossible could become possible, where the sounds in his head could finally be given physical form. The transformation of Brian's relationship with the recording studio represented one of the most significant innovations in popular music history. Prior to Pet Sounds, most recording sessions were straightforward affairs. Musicians would learn their parts, gather in the studio, and capture live performances with minimal overdubbing. The studio was seen as a neutral space for documentation, not a creative tool in its own right. But Brian began to envision the studio as a laboratory for sonic experimentation, a place where traditional rules could be broken and entirely new sounds could be born. He spent hours studying the acoustics of different rooms, understanding how microphone placement could dramatically alter the character of an instrument, learning how echo chambers and reverb tanks could add dimension and emotional depth to even simple musical passages. He hired the legendary Wrecking Crew, an elite group of session musicians who had played on countless hits but had never been asked to create anything quite like what Brian was envisioning. These musicians were capable of playing anything and willing to trust Brian's unconventional vision even when they didn't fully understand it. The Wrecking Crew was composed of some of the most skilled musicians in Los Angeles: Hal Blaine on drums, Carol Kaye on bass, Glenn Campbell on guitar, and many others who had already established themselves as the backbone of the West Coast recording scene. They were accustomed to efficiency, learning parts quickly, nailing performances in minimal takes, and moving on to the next session. But Brian's approach would challenge everything they thought they knew about making records. These musicians brought their own expertise and creativity to Brian's vision. They weren't just hired hands executing his instructions, they were collaborators who understood how to take his sometimes vague emotional directions and translate them into precise musical performances. When Brian asked for something to sound more purple or like teenagers, they had the musical sophistication to interpret these abstract requests and find ways to achieve the effects he was seeking. In Studio B at Western Recorders in Hollywood, Brian began layering sounds that had never been combined before. French horns conversed with harpsichords in ways that classical composers had never imagined. Bicycle bells provided percussion alongside bass harmonicas. He brought in flutes that whispered secrets, strings that soared and sighed, and an electro-theremin that added an otherworldly quality to the arrangements. Nothing was too strange if it served the emotional purpose of the song. Nothing was too beautiful if it could help communicate the feelings he was trying to express. The instrumentation choices for Pet Sounds were as carefully considered as the songwriting itself. Brian wasn't adding unusual instruments as gimmicks or attention-getting devices. Each sonic element was chosen specifically for its ability to contribute to the album's emotional narrative. The French horns added a sense of grandeur and sophistication that elevated the material beyond typical pop music. The harpsichord provided a delicate, intimate quality that supported the album's more vulnerable moments. The bicycle bells and other found sound percussion elements added whimsy and playfulness that kept the music from becoming too serious or precious. Brian's use of the electro-theremin was particularly innovative. This early electronic instrument could produce sounds that were simultaneously futuristic and nostalgic, perfectly capturing the album's themes of yearning for an idealized future while remaining anchored in emotional reality. The instrument's ethereal quality added a dreamlike dimension to tracks like "I Just Wasn't Made for These Times," reinforcing the song's themes of alienation and otherness. The recording process became an act of translation, taking the sounds that existed only in Brian's imagination and making them real. When he couldn't explain what he wanted in technical terms, he'd sing it, hum it, or even play it himself on whatever instrument was available. He knew what he heard in his head with perfect clarity, and he wouldn't stop working until everyone else could hear it too. Brian's communication style in the studio was unique and highly effective. Rather than relying on technical language or traditional musical terminology, he would use emotional and sensory descriptions to convey his intentions. He might ask a string player to make their part more like a sunset, or request that a drum pattern feel like walking on sand. These poetic instructions forced the musicians to engage with the music on a deeper level, to think about the emotional content of their performances rather than just the technical execution. This created a collaborative atmosphere where everyone in the studio became invested in achieving the emotional goals of each song. The musicians weren't just playing their parts, they were helping to create moods, to tell stories, to communicate feelings that couldn't be expressed through words alone. The result was performances that were not only technically excellent, but emotionally authentic and compelling. The studio sessions stretched on for hours, sometimes days, as Brian refined each element. He would have the musicians play the same passage dozens of times, adjusting the timing, the dynamics, the emotional content with each take. The wrecking crew, accustomed to knocking out 3 sessions in a single day, found themselves spending entire days on single songs. But they began to understand that they were participating in something extraordinary. The extended nature of these sessions was necessary for achieving the level of perfection Brian was seeking. Each song on Pet Sounds required not just technical precision, but emotional precision. Every note, every rhythm, every sonic texture had to contribute to the song's ability to communicate specific feelings. This level of attention to detail was unprecedented in popular music, and it required a completely different approach to studio time and budget allocation. Brian would often spend hours on seemingly minor details, adjusting the attack of a bass line, finding the perfect reverb setting for a vocal, determining the exact moment when a string section should enter. To casual observers, this might have seemed like obsessive behavior, but Brian understood that these small details were what separated good music from transcendent music. He knew that listeners might not consciously notice these subtle elements, but they would feel their impact on an emotional level. Brian's approach to recording was revolutionary for its time. Instead of capturing live performances, he was constructing sonic paintings, building layers of sound that created new textures and colors. The studio became his canvas, and every microphone placement, every echo chamber setting, every decision about which instrument to add or remove was a brushstroke in a larger artistic vision. This approach to recording as composition would influence generations of producers and artists who followed. Brian was demonstrating that the recording studio could be an instrument in its own right, a place where musical ideas could be shaped, refined, and transformed into something that existed nowhere else in the world. He was showing how technology could serve artistic vision rather than constrain it, how the seemingly mechanical process of recording could become a deeply creative and expressive medium.
Chapter 6: The Price of Genius. But perfection has a cost, and Brian was beginning to pay it with his sanity, his relationships, and his peace of mind. He would spend whole days re-recording a single vocal, obsessing over inflections and breath control that only he seemed to notice. He'd agonize over tiny details, the way a tambourine rang out, the exact moment when a string section should swell, details that seemed insignificant to others but were crucial to the emotional impact he was trying to achieve. His pursuit of perfection bordered on obsession, and not everyone understood his relentless drive. Some bandmates resisted his increasing control over every aspect of their music. Mike Love, in particular, questioned Brian's new direction. Why change a winning formula? Why alienate fans who expected surf music and hot rods? Why take risks when the current approach was making them all wealthy and famous? The Beach Boys had found their niche, and it was a profitable one. Why jeopardize that for some artistic experiment that might not even work? But Brian couldn't explain his compulsion in rational terms. The music demanded to be made. The sounds in his head demanded to be realized. He just had to, as if he had been chosen as a conduit for something larger than himself, something that required his complete dedication regardless of the personal cost. The album's budget soared, far beyond what pop records were supposed to cost. Recording sessions that should have taken days stretched into weeks. Studio time that normally cost hundreds now cost thousands. Some executives at Capitol Records called it reckless spending. Others whispered about madness, wondering if Brian had lost touch with commercial reality. But for Brian, every dollar spent was necessary. He was chasing a sound that didn't exist yet, pursuing a vision that required new techniques, new approaches, new ways of thinking about what popular music could be. He was speaking to the lonely, the sensitive, the misunderstood, and he knew that reaching them would require music that was itself unconventional, vulnerable, and real. The pressure was immense. Friends worried about his health, his marriage strained under the weight of his obsessions, and industry observers questioned whether he had lost his commercial instincts. But Brian pressed on, driven by an artistic vision that felt more important than any of the external concerns. He was creating something that would outlast any temporary difficulties, something that would justify every sacrifice being made. When the Beach Boys returned from their tour and gathered to hear what Brian had been creating in their absence, they were surprised, confused, and ultimately moved by what they heard. These weren't surf tunes designed to soundtrack summer parties. They were soul tunes, music that spoke directly to the deepest parts of human experience. You Still Believe in Me was an aching confession of gratitude and unworthiness, a song that acknowledged personal flaws while marveling at love's ability to see beyond them. It just wasn't made for these times, was a whispered admission of alienation, the cry of someone who felt fundamentally out of step with the world around them. These were not the carefree anthems fans expected from the Beach Boys, but rather intimate conversations between the artist and listener. The vocal arrangements Brian crafted for these songs were unlike anything in popular music. Instead of the simple harmonies that had made the Beach Boys famous, these were complex, layered creations that seemed to breathe with emotion. Voices entered and exited like characters in a play, sometimes supporting the lead vocal, sometimes contradicting it, sometimes creating new melodic lines that existed in the spaces between the main melody. Even the chord progressions didn't resolve the way pop chords usually did. They turned unexpectedly, moved in directions that surprised the ear, reflecting Brian's emotional twists and turns in their harmonic structure. Where traditional pop songs offered the comfort of predictable chord changes, Pet Sounds challenged listeners to follow more complex emotional journeys, to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity, just as Brian was learning to do in his own life. It was music made from longing, the longing for a connection, for understanding, for a place in a world that often seemed hostile to sensitivity and depth.
It was made from dreams of love, of acceptance, of a future where vulnerability could be strength rather than weakness. And it was made from the deepest part of one young man's soul, the part that refused to be satisfied with commercial success when artistic truth was within reach. The other Beach Boys began to understand that they were no longer just a surf band. They had become something more complex, more ambitious, and potentially more meaningful. The question was whether the world would be ready for this transformation. When Pet Sounds was released in May 1966, the initial reaction was mixed and often confusing. Many American fans, expecting more of the high-energy surf music that had made the Beach Boys famous, were puzzled by the introspective, melancholy tone of the new album. It didn't sound like Fun 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 or California Girls. It was slower, more thoughtful, more demanding of the listener's attention and emotional engagement. Radio stations weren't sure how to program it. The songs didn't fit neatly into existing categories. They were too complex for bubblegum pop, too accessible for art music, too emotional for background listening. Some tracks were too long, others too strange, and the overall mood was too sophisticated for the teenage market that had always been the Beach Boys' core audience. But overseas, particularly in England, critics and musicians were stunned by the album's beauty and depth. The Beatles, who had inspired Brian's vision with Rubber Soul, were among the first to recognize what he had achieved. Paul McCartney called Pet Sounds his favorite album, and later admitted that without it, there would likely be no Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The album became a touchstone for a generation of musicians who were trying to push the boundaries of what popular music could express. Critics began to understand that Pet Sounds represented something unprecedented in popular music, an album that was both commercially accessible and artistically sophisticated, that could appeal to teenagers while also rewarding careful adult listening. It proved that pop music could be as rich and meaningful as any symphony, as emotionally complex as any confessional poetry. The album's influence spread gradually but inevitably through the music world. Artists began to think differently about album construction, about the relationship between individual songs and larger artistic statements. The idea that a pop album could be a unified work of art rather than just a collection of potential singles became more widely accepted and explored. In time, as the initial confusion faded and the album's true significance became clear, the world came to see what Brian had created. Not just a Beach Boys record, but a masterpiece that redefined what popular music could aspire to be. Pet Sounds had proven that commercial music and artistic ambition were not mutually exclusive, that 3-minute pop songs could contain infinite emotional depth, and that the studio could be an instrument for creating entirely new forms of musical expression. And so, as the stars over the Pacific and the tide gently rolls in and out with the same rhythm that inspired Brian's greatest creations, the sounds of Brian Wilson's quiet genius still echo softly across the decades. They remind us that art can emerge from the most unexpected places, that sensitivity can be a source of strength rather than weakness, and that the most profound statements sometimes come disguised as simple pop songs. Pet Sounds remains a lullaby for grown-ups, a dream woven from hope and heartbreak, a reminder that even in the noise and chaos of the world, there is always room for beauty, always space for vulnerability, always time for the kind of deep listening that reveals the extraordinary within the ordinary. Sleep now with the sound of waves in your heart, and the music of pet sounds gently drifting through your dreams, carrying with it the promise that someone, somewhere, understands